My name is Gregorio Luke, and I was born in Mexico City. I am the son of Gloria Contreras, a famous Mexican choreographer and dancer. And very early, we moved to New York, where my mother was doing ballets for George Balanchine. And I had an Indian nanny, a girl from Oaxaca called Reinalda. And she treated me like Indian women treat their child. She had me in these rebozos. And you know, the rebozos is this long scarf that indigenous women in Mexico use. And you know, they wrap the baby in the back and you walk, or in their chest. And Reinalda used to tell my mother, you know, the child is so beautiful that everybody stops and sees to see him. Imagine in Manhattan, watch this Indian woman carrying me in that style. So we lived like that for some time. And then when my mother had contracts to do ballets in places that were different than New York, so for example, she sometimes was invited to do ballets in Argentina or Chile or Brazil. Eventually, my mother received a contract to develop a company sponsored by the University of Mexico. This company would become the Taller Coreográfico de la UNAM, a company she directed for 45 years and that is still going on. And so we established, I established myself fully in Mexico City. And you know, at first we were living with my grandmother. My parents divorced. I was living with my grandmother and my mother, a German lady, Carmen Rueniger, very, very strict. Then my mother remarried and we moved to another house. And at first, I did my first 6 years of studying in the American school in Mexico City. And then when I finished 6th grade, I talked with my mother and we decided that I was not really getting the full experience of what life is in Mexico. And so I went to several banks. I had no success. And then there is a bank in Mexico that is what they call a development bank called Nacional Financiera. And it was one of my last chances. And so I went to Nacional Financiera, or Nafinsa, and I just went on, and I told them that they had to support me. And until it got to a point where the man said, all right, I'll buy you your tickets. He said, and by the way, don't you want to come and work for me? I said, sorry, I never thought of being a banker myself. But when my mother heard about it, she said, what? You're being offered a position in a bank? She says, you better take it or I'll fire you. My mother was my boss. And I took this position, and so overnight, this was like a radical change for me, because I went from being almost a university art promoter to now being also a cultural promoter, because in the bank I was assigned to work in what they call the Fomento Cultural, which was a project to bring culture to the employees in the bank. But now, so suddenly I had to basically completely transform my image, start wearing suits, this whole thing. And so I worked there in this position, and one day, the director of Nacional Financiera, the head banker, one of the most important figures in Mexico's financial system, gave a speech, and he quoted Van Gogh. The letters of Vincent Van Gogh. He was saying something about the founders of the bank and how he said they are not here, but Vincent Van Gogh wrote to his brother, the windmills are not here, but the wind that moved them is still here. The energy is still here. So he was making a parable, and Van Gogh happened to be one of my mother's favorite artists. And when we were growing up, my mother read to us the Van Gogh letters and many other books. My mother read to me Don Quixote, so many books. And so I wrote a letter to this man saying that I loved his speech and that I knew about Van Gogh and that this and that. And to my amazement, he wrote me back. I don't think he knew who I was, but we exchanged several letters, and we became friends by letters, only that I was a small employee and this man was the most important banker in Mexico. Eventually, he became Secretary of the Treasury of Mexico, Gustavo Petricholi, and then he became ambassador of Mexico to the US. And so when I learned that he had been appointed ambassador, I went to look for him, for Gustavo Petricholi, and I said, sir, I have good English because I lived part of my childhood in the United States, and my mother and I could be helpful to you. And the man said, fine. And I remember that it was the second World Cup that was in Mexico. It probably was '86. The day that Maradona scored with his hand, they say. And they announced in the stadium that my friend Gustavo Petricholi had just been named Secretary of the Treasury of Mexico. And so I thought, wow, well, I will never see him again now, he's so important. But to my amazement, he did. You know, I went to see him, and we developed a friendship. And eventually, Petricholi was named Ambassador of Mexico to the US. And so I told him, I wrote to him, and I said that I had a good command of the English language, and that I could, you know, work for him and so on. And he said yes. And so I remember, you know, the appointment that I got, I was named the first Secretary of the Embassy of Mexico in Washington, which is one of the most coveted diplomatic positions. I remember when I arrived to the Foreign Ministry in Mexico, and there were several people waiting for me, and I said, I'm Gregorio Luke. You're his son. No, I'm... They thought that there was some kind of mistake. But indeed, it was true, and I suddenly became a ranking diplomat in Washington, and I changed my life completely, because in Washington, suddenly I had access to diplomats from all over the world, to institutions, to the greatest museums, and this time also coincided with a very important cultural presence of Mexico in the United States. It was a time where there was this huge exhibit, 30 Centuries of Splendor, that was in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and then toured to San Antonio and then to LA, the creation of a network of Mexican cultural institutes. It was like, and so I was part of all that excitement. And I developed these lectures, these presentations that I used to do, because, you know, whenever there was a lot of curiosity and a lot of interest in Mexican culture, and so whenever, you know, a college asked, hey, did you send somebody to talk about Frida Kahlo? I used to go. And I developed these slides. I did my master's in film. I studied journalism and did my master's in film. So I have some idea of imagery. And so I started illustrating these lectures with high quality slides, and then with interlocking slides, so I could project the murals life size. One day in Washington, there was an exhibit of Robert Mapplethorpe at the Corcoran, and this photographer had been censored, and so the militants came at night, and with a slide projector, they projected the censored images on the walls of the museum outside. I looked at that, and it was like an epiphany for me. So I thought, I can do that, and I can project the murals of Mexico, and I can take the image of the murals of Mexico all over the world. Now for me, that was like something that suddenly gave me this idea that I could do that, you know. And I stayed in Washington many years, even after normally, you know, in my case, and you're a political appointee, when the person that appointed you, in my case, Don Gustavo Petricholi, returns, you cease. But in my case, I was lucky, because since I had developed these lectures, I became useful. I was all the time, I was giving 200 lectures a year. And so the next ambassador confirmed me, and I continued to work there about 6 years in Washington, which was a great experience for me. It broadened my world, my relationships, everything. And in Washington, there was a governor in California in my period, Pete Wilson, that was promoting a lot of anti-immigrant measures, the 187 and other very harsh proposals against immigrants. And so the ambassador and others decided, why don't we send Gregorio to Los Angeles so that he can help to create a better image of Mexico in California. So I came to LA, and here I found another important mentor for me, which is José Ángel Pescador. José Ángel Pescador was the Consul General of Mexico in LA. He was a man from Sinaloa. He is a progressive guy, very interesting. And what he told me is, look, I'm not interested in you going off to Beverly Hills and give lectures on the West Side. What I want you to do is to lecture for our kids, for the second and third generation of Mexicans that are born here and that are among the loneliest kids in the world. Because here they are discriminated because they're Mexican, but then they go to Mexico and they're treated as pochos, they're treated as Americans. So those kids are like, we're losing them. I was working in Washington, and things were changing rapidly in California. There was a governor at the time here, Pete Wilson, that was promoting a series of very harsh anti-immigrant measures. And so in the foreign ministry, they thought that I could do a good job here by trying to promote a better understanding and a better image of the Mexican culture here in California. Originally, what the foreign ministry had told me, what they wanted me to do, was to say, we want you to be in all the museums, we want you to promote exhibits, we want you to talk all the, the West Side, Pasadena, all of that part that are the power centers here in LA and in California, and get them to understand Mexico better. However, these instructions changed dramatically when I came here, because I was ready for that. I was ready for Hollywood. I was ready for the jet set. I was ready. I had even found a type of dress, very sharp looking. I made myself some cards that said cultural attaché. I was ready for my jet set time here in LA. And I still remember that my boss had none of it. Here, there is another figure that is very important for me, which is José Ángel Pescador. José Ángel Pescador was the Consul General of Mexico. He's a man from Sinaloa. And very progressive guy, very interested in el pueblo, not just the people that are. This must be 1986, more or less, And the first thing, he looked at the cards and he says, "You are the what? What is this?" And I told him, "Well, that's cultural attaché." I'm not going to have none of this, he said. And then he called his assistant and he said, "Here is Mr. Luke, and I want him to get familiarized con nuestro pueblo here. So I want him to be in los servicios. I want him to do a tour of servicios." What that meant is that he had me for 6 months, making passports, doing visas, going to, doing everything that the consulate does, which is taking care of the Mexican people here, which is a rough endeavor, because people that are, persecuted come to the consulate and they are protected by the consulate. You get wives that are beaten by their husbands that you have to protect, people that just lost their father or their mother that you have to help them get the cadaver back to Mexico, children that are going to be imprisoned. You have to visit prisoners that are on death row. You have to go to the fields and see the campesinos, all of that. I worked, and I think he figured this guy is not going to last. He's not going to like this. He's going to just immediately call Mexico and ask to be changed somewhere else. But I did. I did the whole tour duty. And when I finished, he said, "Okay, well, I'm going to give you now the best title you'll ever have. He says, you're going to be consul for cultural affairs. You're a consul mexicano, which is very important. And it was a big honor. And then he told me, and then something else. He says, I'm not interested in those people in the West Side. All of those people, it's not that they don't like us because they don't understand us. They understand us very, very well. What I want you to do, those museums, those people, they can hire anybody, they can bring anybody, they don't need us. The ones that do need us are all these second and third Mexican American kids that are in all these public high schools and that are the loneliest kids in the planet. So what the commission that José Ángel Pescador gave me was to take care of the Mexican people here in LA, in California. He said, I want you to lecture for our people here, and I want you to put special interest in the young people, those second and third generation Mexican kids that are having all kinds of problems because in the US they're discriminated because they're Mexicans, but then they go to Mexico, and in Mexico they discriminate them because they don't have perfect Spanish. They're considered gringos or pochos. And so these kids are lost. So I want you to go and to speak to them and give them something to feel proud about and so on. And I remember that I went to these high schools. I think it was Roosevelt High School, one of those. And I told the principal, that I had come here and that I was going to speak about Mexico. And the guy said, what? You want me to put 500 teenagers in an auditorium and turn off the light? So I came in there with my little suit, my necktie, and it was a disaster. The kids were never quiet. They threw things at me. They laughed. They talked among themselves. And I had to reinvent myself. To begin with, I had to memorize the lectures so that I could look at them in the eye all the time. And then I had to make my narration focused. I had to put anecdotes. I had to be very clear and a better storyteller. And I had to use bigger images, and I had to kind of create a spectacle. So I went from being a lecturer to become a performer. And I ended up doing hundreds of these shows. Every year I did 200. So by the time, I was, doing all this, and then I had to deal with a normal audience, it was a piece of cake. Because I had been in all of East LA, all Southgate, all South LA, and that gave me an energy and a clarity that I think made me a much better performer. And eventually, my luck ran out, and one day, we received the telegram, and after almost 8 years of work, 8 or 9 years of work, that they were not going to renew my contract in the consulate anymore. And so it was a dramatic thing because I had been a consul, I had been a diplomat, I had an official passport, I was tax exempt, I had immunity, I had a privileged life, and suddenly I had to return all these things, even the plates of my car. And I did not normally when your commission as a consul ends, you go back to Mexico, but I didn't want to do that because my mother's company was going to be performing in LA. So let's say that my contract expired in August and my mother company was performing in February at the Luckman. So I said, well, I'll stay the next 6 months so that I can help her. And so instead of going to Mexico, I stayed here, but now without the privileges that I had before. So I remember that it was something like one morning, I came in there as a consul. And so since I no longer was a consul, I got my passport, they canceled it. I returned all my credentials, everything, even the plates of the car, so I had no place, so I had to park the car. And the only thing that I thought of, well, they issued me my Mexican passport like that, they gave it to me there. So one day, I came in the morning as a diplomat, and I left as an illegal alien. It was like that, in the streets I was. And I started trying to see how I was going to reinvent my life here. And interestingly, while I had been the consul, I had helped a museum, a small museum called MOLA, the Museum of Latin American Art, get an exhibit of Diego Rivera. And so when they heard that I was unemployed, they offered me a job. And so now I was going to be the head of an American institution. So they worked over time. They, got all my papers, everything. And so now I was the head of MOLA. So I moved to Long Beach. And in MOLA, the challenge was to make a museum of Latin American art, not just of Mexican art. So I could say that the most important experience for me at working for MOLA was to becoming a Latin American. Because a lot of as soon as I was appointed, people said, well, this guy is a Mexican and he's been a Mexican consul and, he's going to take MOLA and he's going to make it a Mexican museum, It's going to be Mexican imperialism, they said. And so I made it my job to learn as much as I could about all the cultures. I studied, for example, a lot of the art of Central America. And I did exhibits of the best Panamanian artists, the best Guatemalan artists. I brought Trujillo from Panama, Garcia Cordero from the Dominican Republic, artists from Peru like De Cislo and Chavez, artists from Argentina, from Brazil, and culture from all of these countries. So for me, it was like broadening my horizon. And then another thing that I was doing here is that it was very difficult to bring an audience from LA to Long Beach. And so we had to develop a very vigorous program of special events. It was like the permanent feast. And I started doing like nights in Cuba, in Venezuela, and we organized this, and we had parties, and we had tango shows and cumbia shows and all these things. So it was very interesting for me. And then working in an American environment, because even though I had been almost 9 years in the US, but I had been working in a Mexican institution, now I was in an American institution, which is completely different, And so I was there 9 years. When I came here, the museum was very basic, and I was part of an effort to create this infrastructure that the museum currently has. And at MOLA, I met another great mentor for me. I would say in my life, first and foremost, my mother, Gloria Contreras, is my first mentor. My second would be Petricholi, then José Ángel Pescador, and now at MOLA, Robert Gumbiner. Robert Gumbiner, a multimillionaire, a businessman, a doctor, a very intelligent man. He had all these ideas about healthcare. I remember that Dr. Gumbiner used to say that the problem with the medical system that we have here in the U.S. is that it's an immoral system, he said. And it's immoral because it makes money when people are sick. And the more sicker you get, the more money it makes. So what we need to create is a medical system that makes money when people are healthy, not when people are sick. And so he had all these ideas of healthcare, and in his plan, he starts one of these HMOs, was that art helped people to heal. And so he bought an extensive collection of Latin American art because he felt that the art from Latin America had the most energy and life. And so wherever he placed the painting, either in Mexico or Guatemala, just full of light and energy, and it helped patients recover. And so eventually, sadly, Dr. Gumbiner's idea of what he said, the way that we can make a system that makes money by keeping people healthy is by a system that is all inclusive, that assures to take care of you. So it's always less expensive to prevent you from getting sick than to remedying you. And so a system that puts the emphasis on prevention, on taking early care of you. So it was a system that worked very well for the patients, but it did not work very well for the hospitals and all the others. And so eventually, Dr. Gumbiner's dream was destroyed. They did what they call a hostile takeover of his company, which is the bigger medical institutes basically bought him out. and separated. His company destroyed it because they didn't want to have this competition, right? And so he ended up with a lot of money, but angry and frustrated at what had happened to him. And the Latin American art collection was his. It was personal, and the building that he had here in Long Beach in 7th was also his. And so he put them together, and he said, "Well, let's do a museum." And he started this museum, and then he had seen that I had helped him, and so he put me there. And he gave me a lot of freedom. But he was also a tough businessman. And he taught me how to look at things from a different perspective until now, whether it was working in the university with my mother or in the embassy and the consulate, my goal was always just like the mission of getting the art or going to the schools. Now I had to manage a program, and I had to figure out a budget, and I had to make sure that it broke even and all this. And so as long as I stayed in the black, I could do anything I wanted. He gave me a lot of freedom. And at MOLA, I came to a lot of important conclusions. Among others, we created a monthly calendar. Most museums have a 6 months or a 3-month calendar. But by us having a monthly calendar, we could take advantage of artists that were here stranded. So for example, maybe you could grab them, an artist that came to perform in LA on a Saturday. Maybe he had a free Thursday, and you could invite him and he could perform at MOLA. That's how we got people from the Buena Vista Social Club. And like that, we could grab artists of all kinds. And we put together a very interesting program, a very dynamic program. And the mural and the lectures just kept on growing. I kept doing more lectures. My lectures became part of the programming of MOLA. And then I started doing lectures for everything, because any opportunity that we had to make money for the museum, like if it was Valentine's Day, I created this lecture on love. And then we invited people, and I talked about love, and we sold them the aphrodisiac cuisine from Latin America. If it was whatever, I kept on doing all these things. But then something that changed me is this important electronic company that did all these high-end projectors said to the museum, "We'll give you the best projectors if you find a creative way of using them." MOLA has a big parking lot and a building with a big wall, and I'll do a lecture there. And he said, "You're crazy? You think that somebody's gonna pay money to sit on a parking lot to watch you give a lecture on that wall?" Well, something magical happened. Because the same lecture that I used to give in an auditorium for 50 people, now that I took it outside and I put it on a parking lot, became a sensation. And I went from 50 to 500 to 1,000 to 2,000 people. And so that's how Murals Under the Stars were born. By doing these massive lectures that suddenly, it became like a rock concert. And with an energy, and I started getting invitations all over the world. And so when I when we finished building the museum, I had the alternative of staying there. I could have stayed at MOLA, probably could still be there. But all my career as a speaker had gotten so much force that I decided I have to focus on my lectures. I have to risk it all. I have to quit my day job, and I have to become a speaker. And everybody told me, "But you're going to die of hunger. You cannot survive by giving lectures. Who's going to hire you? You don't have a salary. You're not affiliated to university. What is going to happen to you?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. But I don't want to be old and to figure out what my life could have been." So I just took this gamble. This is exactly 10 years ago. The age of my daughter, Amara. And so I left MOLA, and since then, I've been giving lectures everywhere. I've gone to Europe, I've been in Asia, I've lectured in Florence, in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, in Manila, in Buenos Aires, certainly in Mexico, in the US. And I've done it not just in museums, but also in parks, in plazas. I've lectured for 10,000 people in big spaces. I've also gotten involved with KPFK, where I do a weekly radio show for the past 6 years or so. And so my repertoire of lectures has expanded. I do about 40 lectures a year. I have created my own nonprofit, which is called Arcos, it's Art in Communities and Schools. We, the Latino immigrants, are the new wave that is renovating America, that is making it young again, that is making it fresh again. And the reason that I have dedicated my life to culture is because I think that precisely the way to awake the sleeping giant is through culture, is by becoming aware of where we come from, who we are, and what we can offer. So I try to go to the schools, I try to go to the plazas, I talk about our great artists, I talk about our great authors, I talk about our music, I do radio shows on them, I try to give our people cohesion and hope. And I also try to make the larger American community aware of our contributions and the positive nature of our community, and how I see that our community is linked to the true greatness of this nation. So that's what I do, and that's what I'm here for. I'm trying to awaken that sleeping giant of the Latino community in the United States.